Hello and welcome to this look at the suburbs. The growth and expansion of the suburbs and suburban lifestyles tell us a lot about who we are. In the 20th and 21st century in particular, suburban lifestyle has become synonymous with the American dream, has become synonymous with the way in which we achieve social mobility. When we talk about the suburbs, we often do so in stereotypical manners. We talk about these areas that are mass produced and low density, where one house in a neighborhood is similar to the next, both in terms of size and layout, and that we are separating where we live, our residential area, from where we work. We also look at a high level of social homogeneity and the idea that our neighbors are similar. And historically, suburbs have been marketed to narrow economic groups. So we have middle class or upper middle class or working class suburban neighborhoods. The marketing of the American dream has been profound in the evolution of suburbs. The idea that a nuclear family with 2.5 kids lives in a suburban area, and that the combination of rural areas and convenience are what drives the attraction to these places. So in our look today, we'll ask ourselves, are these stereotypes true? Are they rooted in fact? And we'll see that in our different suburban areas, we do find mass-produced low-density living. We do find high levels of social homogeneity. We do find depictions and marketing and remarketing of this American dream. But we're also going to find places that are quite diverse and that have changed since the mid 20th century when the suburban boom, particularly in the United States, took hold. We're going to ask ourselves why and where certain suburbs exist. And we're going to look at 4 important factors to answer these questions. One is culture. What is the demand? What is the cultural attachment to suburban spaces? A second is urban living conditions. Are our urban areas in poor shape? Is there a push factor driving people out of our urban areas into the metropolitan fringe? And the second 2 factors are quite important when we examine the growth of suburbs. The first is transportation. How efficiently and effectively can we move people in and out of our downtown areas? If transportation is lacking, we can't expand our suburbs. But as we'll notice, between rail, between early on ferry, later on automobiles, we have adopted transportation technology to grow our metropolis. And the fourth, which is really important, is policies. Policies extend beyond investment in transportation. And as we're going to see, policies, particularly in the mid 20th century, affected who could live where, limited who could go where. And our suburbs, again, particularly in the 20th century, reflected these policy shifts. When we take a historic look at suburbs, the literal translation means under the city. And historically, our suburbs were marginalized areas, people that didn't benefit from what a city had to offer, didn't benefit from the economic opportunities, from the infrastructure, from the schools, from the police and fire protection. So the suburbs historically were not places that were deemed as ideal. Suburbs have long been a place where work and living is separated. So we have that residential or bedroom community, meaning we have a clear separation of work and living space. Suburbs have always been dependent on the city. So one of the things we'll revisit is this idea that suburban expansion and suburban prosperity still relies on a city. And oftentimes we find that uneven growth that David Harvey talked about, where the suburbs are prosperous and the city is struggling, but they can't exist independently. That dependency is there, and while the suburbs exist on the periphery, they still rely on and require a healthy city. As we'll note coming up, suburbs exist in many forms. Historically, suburbs looked very different than they do today. Looking at this picture of a former Roman city, and then into the 19th century, the early suburbs took on a different look than what we find today in the 21st century. The first spatial form that we're going to look at is known as an industrial suburb. And you can look at the map on your screen and see the location of Sparrows Point. Sparrows Point was home of a former steel mill. And if you look at Google Maps, you can still see the old street pattern. You can see the numbered and lettered streets on the right-hand side of this map cutout. Here's an overhead view of Sparrows Point, and today it doesn't look great. You can see where the former industry has left. But Sparrows Point today is being recreated as a warehouse and distribution hub. Here's an image from about 100 years ago of what Sparrows Point looked like as the steel mill started to grow and expand. Now, in addition to the steel mill, this was a suburb because people lived here. So there was a mix on the outskirts of the sites of production of residential buildings, housing. Here's a color photo from the 1960s, around 1960, of the Sparrows Point community. As you can see, tree-lined streets, mass-produced housing, right? Very similar, socially homogeneous, economically homogeneous on this block. But Sparrows Point, like many of our industrial suburbs, suffered over the long term. As the steel mill expanded, as it continued to hire people, expand its workforce, expand its footprint, we found that the environment, the natural environment around Sparrows Point was deemed undesirable and created a push factor for people to leave. So as the steel mill expanded, people started to head elsewhere. But this example of an industrial suburb really does support the early company towns that heavy industry built so that people would live right next to work. The social stratification found in Sparrows Point was apparent, and you can see the different housing that was found on these different blocks. On the top left were the large homes for the executives. On the top right, you see a photo of the housing for managers in mid-level employees. And then on the bottom left, you find housing for more of your entry-level and blue-collar workforce. In addition to housing, Sparrows Point, which was managed by Bethlehem Steel, also built sites for recreation. As you can see here, there were slips and docks for boats. There were different parks and outdoor space, golf courses, to help the community solidify its status. Here's another image of what Sparrows Point looked like in the first half of the 1900s, housing right next to sites of production. And again, this would be a good example of an industrial suburb. The next type of suburb we're going to look at was built around Leesburg Pike and Dolly Madison Boulevard. Now, this picture from the first half of the 1900s looks like a pretty rural place. You can see the country road in the background, that's Leesburg Pike, and the car driving towards us at the intersection of Dolly Madison Boulevard. Many wouldn't recognize that this intersection, less than a century ago, transformed into Tysons, Virginia, formerly known as Tysons Corner. And this type of suburban spatial form coincides with what is known as an edge city. An edge city is an area that is economically self-sufficient. It has dense commercial and residential land use, and it is sometimes referred to as an accidental city because these cities were not planned early on. They grew on the outskirts of a major city as transportation became more available. You can see here that Leesburg Pike looks nothing like it did in the early 20th century, and that this major interchange supports a high level of commuter traffic, supports a high level of traffic for work, for shopping, for retail. Here's another image showing you different modes of transportation moving in and out of Tysons today. So Tysons, formerly known as Tysons Corner, really supports that idea of an edge city, where a mall replaces Main Street, where people have access to work, retail, recreation in a high-density area. The edge city, again, includes that term city, so its suburban form is different than what we would find in some of our lower density areas. A third type of suburb is known as a technoburb. And a technoburb, again, is socially and economically viable, found on the periphery, and oftentimes an exurb, meaning that it is excluded from a metro area. What we're looking at on the map is Route 128 outside of Boston. We have in the background, you see Silicon Valley, Biotech Beach, places like Fishman. These technoburbs, again, are areas that grow outside of our city. So they fall into that suburban area, that suburban definition. And our fourth type of spatial form would be sprawl. And this image from a Levittown in the mid-1900s shows us the early forms of sprawl. And sprawl really looks at low density development on the urban fringe. Oftentimes there's a lack of planning, not within the residential development itself, rather a lack of planning as far as coordination with other sprawling developments. So sprawl has long been a characteristic of suburbs, and sprawl continues today, where areas that were considered sprawl in the 1950s and 60s are considered inner ring suburbs today. Highlighting that idea again of David Harvey of uneven development, we see that there is a lot of interest, investment, financial gain to building outside of the urban area. It's cheaper to build new on the outer area on the fringe where land is cheaper than it is to rebuild, than it is to maintain infrastructure and development inside the urban area. So the factor of expansion in this topic of sprawl continues to reflect demand, culture, but it also comes at a social cost, an economic cost, and an environmental cost. And we see that this idea of suburban growth and expansion isn't just a US or a North American or Western European concept. In different parts of the world, we're seeing the adaptation of suburbs. And in some cases, it looks a lot like the United States. In others, particularly in Latin America and Asia, we're seeing more high density living, high rise living. Corbusier had the radiant city design where people are stored in these high rises. We're finding those types of concepts adopted in places like China, places that are in some of our mega cities in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. We're also seeing some very identifiable aspects of American suburbs in other countries. As China's economy grows and becomes more affluent, there is a greater and greater demand for suburban living. And China has recreated a place called Orange County. And you can see in the picture on the right-hand side of the screen two police officers walking through a neighborhood that looks like one you would find in Southern California. The architectural design looks like that you'd find at Newport Beach or Manhattan Beach in Orange County, California. This type of living becomes a cultural export for other countries.